view from the helicopters was amazing, over the green fields and the buffaloes. And sometimes flying over the sites, you could see the tracer rounds coming up from the ground as they would shoot at the helicopters. We were a culture shock for the Vietnamese because of our stockings with seams in them. They thought we had permanent lines up the back of our legs.
When I wrote back to my parents, I didn't tell them much about the war at all. I certainly never talked about the casualties. I felt they just didn't need to know those things.
Often you would just get the 5-minute siren and you know you would have to run. But yes, I guess the adrenaline did start to pump and we would always be wondering what we would be confronted with.
He was shot through the neck and his whole life was just totally blown away with one bullet wound.
To be quite truthful, I don't think any of us had any idea what it was about. You know, we were members of the army and you just said, you'll go here and you'll go there, and ours was not to question why.
It's something that even now when you hear a helicopter, it can take you right back to the experiences because it does for me represent the sound of Vietnam.
Pauline on the left.
That's Maggie and me.
Yeah.
Oh, is that okay?
There we
Oh, that's
are.
all.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
that's all very
I'm
well
looking
known.
at something fairly extraordinary.
You've got a bit of a shocked look on your face, Terry.
Fancy that.
When we landed in Vietnam, we landed in Saigon, and it was hot, it was humid, and there were thousands and thousands of planes on the tarmac. I'd never seen so many planes, and they were all in camouflage colours. And it was so busy and it was so active, and that's when I felt really overwhelmed. That really brought home where we were. So then we had to travel to the 1st Australian Logistic Group, which was the Australian base at Vung Tau, and it was stark. It was sandy, it was dry, it was barren, there were no trees, and there were just all these wooden buildings and lots of canvas. The hospital was very different from a clinical environment back in Australia. I think we probably just kept absorbing our new environment of where we were.
The patients were our age. Many of them were even younger. They were missing home. They were homesick. They were frightened and scared. And we represented their mothers and their sisters and their girlfriends.
We felt for the boys, but you didn't let it get to you. You tried to make a big steel shutter there.
We were nursing predominantly Australian and New Zealand soldiers who were fighting in Phuoc Tuy province, the Australian area of patrol.
American Forces Vietnam Network.
Our troops were based at Nui Dat, about 30 kilometres up the road from the 1st Australian Field Hospital in Vung Tau, or 20 minutes in a helicopter once they were wounded.
When they were wounded out in the field and there was to be a dust-off, a long siren would go, and everyone knew then that we were going to get casualties. And it didn't just affect the hospital, it affected the whole area. And that was quite impacting on not just the hospital staff, but everyone.
The boys would race out along the dirt to carry them in, and they would arrive in triage. The padre would be there for them. The doctors, the nurses and the medics would be there as a team. We would assess and prioritise their injuries. Chest and abdominal injuries were always taken into theatre first.
These boys were young and fit and at the peak of condition, and they would be wounded in the field, and 20 minutes later they could be on the table in the triage area being resuscitated. Even today, in any major hospital in Australia, to get someone from a motor vehicle accident onto a theatre table in 20 minutes would be unheard of. So it was revolutionary type nursing that we were seeing.
6 Australians have been killed and another 15 wounded in a weekend operation against the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tri province. Army headquarters said the list of casualties is the biggest for Australian forces since the Battle of Long Tan last August. One of the wounded named last night, Alexander Jock Sutherland, is in a critical condition.
One of my memorable patients was Jock Sutherland. He'd lost an eye, he'd lost a leg, he had multiple shrapnel wounds, and it was also very dicey whether we'd be able to save his arm or not.
And he was unforgettable because he was the sickest person that we treated. I recall saying to him, "Now, Jock, you must close your eyes and go to sleep because you're exhausted." And he said, "No, there's no way I can go to sleep because if I go to sleep, I'll never wake up." So I said, "I promise you, if you go to sleep, you'll wake up and you'll feel a lot better than you do now." And he said, "Well, I'll go to sleep on the condition that you stay with me while I'm asleep." So I was going out, but that was the finish of that bit of a social thing, and it was quite an honour to sit about while he did have his sleep.
General Westmoreland came to visit the hospital, and he shook Jock's hands and had his photo taken with him because of his bravery in the battle he was in.
He must have got a lot of press in Australia because cartons of mail turned up, letters from admirers, and we had turns in reading them out, having great amount of joy and laughter. You know, we used to say, "Goodness, Jock, you're a star."
After he went home, it wasn't until I came back here to Canberra that I bumped into Jock and his wife again. And he hadn't remembered his time in the hospital because of all the fever and trauma. Unfortunately, Jock died of cancer since.
That looks as if it could have been an actual exit wound. The shot through the back and an exit wound in the abdomen.
We were all very well trained general nurses, but upon arrival one found oneself in an acute situation, quite a very different circumstance to anything that I could have got my head round in Australia. There was really no preparation for what we were doing. We were in the army, we learned the life cycle of a mosquito and how to build a latrine and a bit of marching and how to behave in the mess. Really, there was no preparation, I don't recall, for what we were going to see over there.
You could have head wounds, chest wounds, open and closed. You could have open abdominal wounds, amputations of all types of limbs, and a lot of shrapnel wounds, which as the blast explodes, the shrapnel sprays all over your body, so you've got chunks of metal all over you, really.
With a gunshot wound, they have one entry point and then they implode inside. So they exit and leave, and while they're in the body, they absolutely smash wherever they were, particularly if it was an abdomen. And then they have this huge exit wound. So the body would have been very, very badly damaged.
I took photos while I was in Vietnam because I thought that they would be of interest and would be needed for the teaching of the other nurses and medical staff coming up to Vietnam. Nothing can prepare you for what you walk into in a war zone, but I just thought it might help them because we didn't see those slides beforehand.
The biggest fears that these young people had, the amputees or the ones that may have had any form of genital injuries, they're young, fit males. What are they? They're thinking, what's my girlfriend going to think? What's my wife going to think? I don't want to go home because what is there for me for life? It seems hard to express this, but you would just give them love, but in a very, very sort of nurturing way, so that you knew that they knew if you could sort of give them a hug and a love, that perhaps going home was not going to be so bad. It was very difficult because we were young and we knew what they had ahead of them.
The boys used to like us to look feminine. I mean, we never went to work without at least lipstick on. You couldn't wear too much makeup because it was too hot, but we always wore perfume because you get a soldier in who'd been wounded and he's lying there and he's feeling like death warmed up, and you'd lean over him and he'd go, "Oh, sister, you smell so nice." And so, you know, after that happened a couple of times, we never ever went to work without perfume, and I always kept a bottle of it in theatre, and every time we heard a chopper coming, with the perfume, just because it made the boys feel good.
We were nurses, but we were officers. And in the army, there isn't supposed to be fraternisation between the officers and the other ranks. But it's very difficult, particularly as we worked with them all the time. We were friends with everybody. On the one hand, if we were needed to be officers, then that's what we were. But certainly from my point of view, if I needed to be a nurse or a friend, then I was equally able to do that. And blow being an officer.
When we were able to, the unit used to put on a barbecue of a Sunday where all ranks mixed. Go for a swim if you wanted to, or just sit around and have a few beers, a bit of a chat. Everybody had a great time. Our unit was like one big family. Something affected one, it affected everybody.
Di, you're as drenched as a duck.
It was very, very humid and wet.
Yeah, these must be Collins.
That's Amy.
We were washing our hair. It was pouring rain, and we were standing on the edge of the roof washing our hair.
The monsoon season teemed rain like you've never seen every day. It just fell from the heavens and you were drenched.
When I was up there, we had a very big outbreak of malaria, and we had the soldiers coming down from Nui Dat. And they were brought in from the field, and often it was from very wet conditions, good breeding ground for mosquitoes. We had them coming in very, very sick boys. They really were. And I mean, you just wouldn't have one, you'd have half a dozen coming off the helicopter and very ill. And we had the medical ward full, and they were over at the American Field Hospital because we couldn't accommodate them all. One day I came on and they were in my triage area theatre because we'd run out of beds for them. So they were everywhere in the hospital that had a spare bed. At first they thought the troops weren't taking their tablets, but it wasn't that at all. It was a different strain of malaria, and so they changed the drugs and they actually put them on a drug called Dapsone. They were very, very ill boys. It was like having your own little war within the hospital.
Oh, goodness. That is Terry when she was Miss RSL's Princess year 1967.
I didn't become queen, but I cracked it for the princess. Coming from Goulburn, Goulburn have a festival every year called Lilac Time Festival. But because I was in Vietnam, the RSL had decided to nominate a Queen candidate, being me. My sister got the job of doing all the fundraising and appearances, and while I languished back in Vietnam. We raised the second amount of money, I think. So I didn't get to be the Queen, but I did manage to become a princess. The boys all thought it was a bit of a hoot. Thought, who's this maniac? Goulburn must be a crazy place.
We nursed the prisoners of war in the intensive care unit, and of course they would be interrogated. And they would be in the intensive care unit because they were badly wounded, and it was my job to nurse them. It was very difficult when they were being interrogated by the South Vietnamese because they would become distressed, and we would have to stop the we wouldn't have to stop. I chose to stop the interrogation because while ever they were a patient in the unit, then their comfort was my primary concern. But my understanding was that when these people became well enough to be moved, they would be taken from the intensive care unit and their drips and their plasters would be taken off. And they would be interrogated and then they would possibly be shot. And that was very difficult for me.
There's our poor old lady, little Vietnamese lady that she was a POW.
And I used to give smokes to and put lipstick on it,
yeah.
Much to everybody's horror.
And she's missing her right leg, or the lower part of her right leg.
We didn't have a lot of prisoners of war, but we had a few. And we had this lovely little lady who I used to put a bit of lippy on and give us cigarettes to, and on the boys were furious with me, the soldiers. And I used to say, well, if it was me, I'd be terribly grateful for someone putting a bit of lippy on me. You can think of the enemy, but when you actually see and touch them, you know, you think, oh, I'd hate to think of you being shot.
Vietnam was my first experience of the East. Certainly the smells of the East will remain with me forever. Another image that remains with me is just how the cycle of life continued, even though that there was a war on. People seemed to be going around their daily activities. We were cared for by the local women who came into the compound every day. And even though they were at war and they were poor, they tried to maintain a semblance of normality in their lives by just coming to work like we would be in Australia, ready for the day's activity.
We called her Mama San, and we became to love her dearly. And we were able to communicate very satisfactorily without speaking the language. A lot of our conversation was in numbers. Number 1 was very good. Number 12 wasn't nice. Number 33 was appalling. So if you had a visitor, she would put 3 pips 2 rooms down for you.
One day I had a cake of soap and my mama son, she liked this and she would smell it and she'd say, baby son, for the baby, you see. So then I got my mother to send more cakes of soap up and I used to give her the cakes of soap. She might have sold it on the black market, but at least I thought it was going to the baby son.
Gee, we actually got to fire these. We weren't just...
Yeah, we weren't allowed to hold weapons? Yes.
No, that's right. The M60 grenade launcher, ladies.
Really?
Yes, and that's me putting a grenade
Well, at
in
least
my
you
mouth.
understood where the wounds came from, didn't you?
If that had happened to us, we would have been sent home.
It was written up in the American Army paper that there were 4 Australian Army nurses in Vietnam. It was through some of the nurses at the American 36 Evacuation Hospital in Vung Tau were asked to arrange to see if we could go up to visit the American 1st Division headquarters at Phuoc Bin, which was north of Saigon. Choppers arrived, picked us up, and we had an escort of 2 gunships to make sure that if we were fired upon that we'd be safe. They took us out to the firing range and they showed us how to use a variety of weapons, from revolvers to grenade launchers, throwing live grenades, which was, like you got it out of your hand before it went off. And we'd lie on our belly with a machine gun and you just looked, it was really great. We all had a ball.
When we went to visit the army base up north, they were showing us the booby traps, etc. The Viet Cong were very ingenious in their making of their booby traps, from punji sticks to the different types of grenades that they would make out of cans and catch the soldiers unaware.
We were just walking along a path and there was a sergeant with us and he'd say, "Stop." You stop for? And just don't move your feet, just look down, and there'd be a very thin, like a piece of fishing line type of thing across the track. And he said, "Now step back." And then he, with a stick, would move it. And a bamboo punji board, it's like a board with bamboo spikes, usually dipped in buffalo dung and stuff like that. It would just go across the track, so that any unwary soldier sort of tripped that and this thing had come across and hit them. There was a real insight into what our soldiers would come up against when they're out on patrol.
You could always hear the continual bombing of the B-52s. It was incessant, and it used to, in fact, if they were having a really heavy time of bombing and hitting, the furniture used to move and shake, and it used to be night and day. You were very, very aware of it. It was incessant.
Often we didn't have very much warning at all. Often you would just get the 5-minute siren and you know you would have to run. But yes, I guess the adrenaline did start to pump, and we would always be wondering what we would be confronted with.
And then you would wait. You would wait for those 3 short blasts, which meant that the chopper was within landing. And that was always a very stressful time if it took longer than about 15 to 20 minutes from that first long blast to the short ones, because what you knew is that the dust-off choppers were being attacked. They were under fire, and so they couldn't get in. And if you had more than an hour's wait, everybody would actually go down towards the hospital because you were feeling so anxious that the dust-off choppers were being shot at and they couldn't get in, and the wounded were there and they couldn't evacuate them.
One evening we had some casualties. We had this one lad, he'd been shot in the abdomen and he was resuscitated, and the padre called me over, and this lad sort of looked up, bit of a cheeky grin. I think he was a National Service boy, if I remember correctly. And he said, looking at me, with private to a lieutenant, he said, "Good day, love, how are you?" And I said, "I'm all right, but more to the point, how are you?" And he said, "Oh, I'm better now." We had a chat and everything. Anyway, sadly, he had a massive bleed, which we couldn't stop, and we lost him on the theatre table. And that was really quite traumatic. That was one thing I really, really affected me. One stage there, when I started to talk about Vietnam, I'd start to cry. And I couldn't work this outdoor because I'd spoken about Vietnam, I'd talked about Vietnam, I'd met my friends from Vietnam and everything like this. And I sort of traced that back to that instant when we lost that boy. I still remember that very vividly and very sadly that we lost him.
At Da Nang Theatre number 1 this evening.
Vung Tau was a thriving city. It was a rest and recreation centre for Australians, Americans and the VC.
The Red Cross is here in Vientam.
It had the beach. We had the Vietnamese beach, the American beach. The Aussies had the back beach.
Down in Vung Tau, you'd see lots of bars and lots of bar girls, and they used to get the giggles when they saw the Australian nurses coming because they knew that we were sisters and nurses, and they would laugh and entice us and you know, come for a massage. And we just sort of smiled and laughed and talked to them in the limited Vietnamese we had.
APO in country 96307.
If Australian soldiers came down, they usually went drinking at the Badco Club at the Australian base. I think seeing the young bit ones as they were down on R&C having a break, or perhaps before they went back for another patrol, that used to make me feel quite sad, because you're young, you're fit, you're having a great time. Tomorrow, where will you be?
Today, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops have launched heavy attacks on provincial capitals across South Vietnam on the sacred Vietnamese lunar festival, the Tet. Street fighting is raging in several cities. Details are sketchy, but reports coming true say that the Reds are swarming into city by city. Australians and New Zealanders have been involved in some of the heaviest fighting outside Saigon. Australian casualties rose by 17 over the weekend.
The 1968 Tet Offensive was a period of my life I will never forget. We were inundated with casualties. It went on for weeks.
As quick as we could get them into the theatre, which had 2 tables going at once, the triage area was filling up with more.
We had bunks double-decked in the wards of those that we had to keep in the hospital.
We were so tired. We were just working on pure adrenaline and giggling at nothing.
I'd worked in theatres with motor vehicle accidents, but there was nothing really that I had done to prepare me for this. We had our only death in the hospital during that period. He was a young man that had been out on patrol. He had trodden on a mine. He knew he was on the mine. He had warned the rest of the patrol, and they all scattered, took as much cover as they could. And when he saw that they were out of harm's way as best they could be, he jumped, or he sort of dived face first off the mine. And these mines, once you release the pressure on them, they jump up out of the ground and explode. And he took the full force of that explosion in his buttocks. And he was still alive when we got him. But from his waist to the back of his knees was just raw flesh, and you could see all his bowel and everything through it. And the medics on the chopper had been pouring fluids into him. We did the same thing, but as fast as we poured it in, it just poured out. And we couldn't save him, and he was the only boy that we lost. And I'll never forget that. I mean, there were some very horrific injuries, but that one has stuck in my mind.
I dare you not Isn't he gorgeous?
Oh, cheeky little devil. She was probably going to school or something.
I still feel a great amount of joy thinking about Mott, the dear little boy. He was, I suppose, 8, and he was carrying ammunition for his mother and father, who the Australians shot, and they brought him into our hospital, and he had malnutrition and ill and, oh, awful. However, they gave him blood transfusions and got him better, and he was put in the medical ward. And I must say the soldiers in the beds round him were very good to him, and they sent the Red Cross out to buy him toys. Oh, they spoiled him, absolutely spoiled him.
When the South Vietnamese army wanted to take him to the prison camp, we would get the doctors to sign a chit to say that he was still too ill to move. And I think they might have found out that after he'd been going to school for about 6 months, that he was all right.
But all of a sudden, orders from on high said he's got to go. And we were all very distressed, but we had no say. He went to an orphanage with all his toys. Gosh knows how long he kept those.
Gee, you look glamorous, Di. You up to that?
Yes.
That's Philip.
Oh, it's Philip.
Every one of us who went to Vietnam would have only ever gone with the idea of doing a really good nursing job and completing a year and coming home. So meeting someone or meeting my husband was certainly not on the agenda. And my cousin was with 6th Battalion, and they decided to have a barbecue, and my cousin said, well, my cousin is a nurse down at the hospital, so that is sort of a carte blanche for let's get up the nurses. So we went up by chopper and we had a really enjoyable day, and I met Philip that day, and from there we corresponded. Towards the end, in the last couple of months, we were writing to each other most days. We had a dear friend who was a chopper pilot, and Peter used to bring Philip's mail back, and sometimes he would actually land on the Vampire pad, and that was a little embarrassing because he would only land to deliver my mail, and it was quite obvious as to why he'd landed. He hadn't landed with a dust off, he'd landed with mail.
We all had boyfriends up to that, and we'd be waiting for when they'd come down, and we'd have a few hours, and we'd go into town for dinner. And there was a wonderful restaurant downtown Vung Tau called Mrs. Cernot's, and it was a French restaurant. And all we ever ate was lobster thermidor, French fries, fried tomatoes, and crepe Suzettes. And the blokes paid every time. And the only wine we had was Mateus Rosé. Remember, this is 1970, and I was so unsophisticated. And to me, Mateus Rosé was such an elegant wine, and to be able to sit up and eat this exotic food was exciting. And, you know, that made everything seem really normal, to be able to do that.
I received a gunshot wound to the abdomen. At the time, I didn't realise how serious it was. I could feel the pain, but I wasn't sure what had happened to me at the time. I was loaded onto an Iroquois helicopter and then flown down to Vung Tau. I was in and out of consciousness, so there were just snapshots of memories.
In his operation, large segments of his bowel had to be removed, and it was sewn together. And unfortunately for him, because of infection, it didn't heal, and it required many trips back to the theatre. And my personal opinion is that this soldier should have died.
I always got the impression that it was something that we could beat, and I suppose most of that impression was gained from Anne.
He was such a fighter, And there was a time when I thought he wasn't going to make it. And I could only think to say to him, come on, Morgan, I've invested too much time in you for you to die now. I want you to fight some more.
Anne had that presence, and I suppose you could almost call her a typical Australian larrikin. And she'd start telling me stories about what was going on, and she would tell me about which nurse was going out with which member of my battalion. But they were clearly done to take my mind off what I was going through at the time, and I certainly appreciated that.
But above all, I wanted him to live, and he did live, and he has gone on to have a very distinguished career in the Army, and we see each other from time to time, and I remember him as the biggest success story of my time in Vietnam.
I got an awful whisker rash that day.
The other girls were all on duty and I was off, so I was swanning around in a silk dress and they were in uniform. In amongst my slides there is one of me stretched across the knees of about 4 soldiers.
We scrounged around and found as many decorations as we could and made every attempt to recreate Christmas in Vietnam just as it would be at home. We were interviewed by some TV crew. We were allowed 30 seconds to send a message home and we were told that we weren't to cry.
Hello, Mum and Dad, Mary and Alan and the Dailies and Tom and Molly and all my other friends in Australia. Merry Christmas to you all and thank you very much for all the lovely cards and parcels.
We did the traditional army thing at Christmas. Officers served the other ranks their Christmas dinner and Father Christmas came and handed out little gifts to everybody, a bottle top or sort of stupid things, but wrapped up and looked like Christmas, and we made it as normal as Christmas as possible. Fortunately, it was a day when we had no casualties come in.
He was a very close friend of ours. He had been a classmate of my cousins, and we were all one very big group when we were all training together. And he was shot, and he was killed instantly. And when I found out who it was, I rang another friend who was on the base. He'd been at Duntroon with him, and he came down and we just sat and held each other and just cried because we were all very close friends, and he'd left a new wife behind in Australia, and I think it was, he just.
We had a fun day that day. We used to run MedCap, which is a medical civil aid program visit to a village called Nam Bin. Once a week, a doctor, one of us girls, and 2 or 3 medics, we would go out. We would treat minor illnesses. But I was given this baby to hold, and I had my photo taken. Well, that subsequently appeared in numerous newspapers and is now been incorporated into the Nurses' Memorial. I felt so proud that I was chosen, or that particular shot was chosen, to represent all the Australian Army nurses, or all service nurses.
Each person did a tour of Vietnam for a year, and it was called 365 Days in Hawaii from the day that you arrived in country. And you really marked it off on a calendar, and it was a countdown, and as it got closer and closer, you got more excited.
We were all extremely ready to come home. We were all burnt out. We were tired. We were exhausted. Our clothes had worn out. We needed new clothes. We needed to come back to our families.
I came out of the door to seas of faces as you do coming off an aircraft, and it didn't take me very long to spot my family because they were making a moderate amount of noise. And my mother and father and sister and aunts and I think probably cousins, they were all there, and it was a very special moment in my life.
I flew from Sydney to Casino, and Mum and Dad met me at the airport, and they were so pleased that I was home. And Dad stopped off at a hotel in Casino, and he said, "Do you want to come in, Bub?" And I don't think he had any need to be in that hotel in Casino, but I just think he trumped up some excuse to take me into that hotel, because he took me round and introduced me to all the auctioneers that were in there and said, "This is my daughter Anne, and she's just come back from Vietnam." And I think he was so proud.
After I was posted back to Australia, I met my future husband, who was with the SAS battalion. He was posted to Vietnam, so we decided we'd get married before he went. He was wounded a couple of times, and knowing what the wounds could be, it could be little or it could be anything. So being the wife at home was worse than being in Vietnam.
It wasn't really till I came home and I realised that I missed Philip terribly, and his mail was also reflecting the same thing, so that was great. My parents commented that they thought that Philip would be the person that would marry me because he was the one person I never talked about very much. I was very quiet about him, so that made them think that he was very different from all the others.
Today in Sydney, thousands of people have gathered at Town Hall to protest Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. There's an air of tension as police position themselves, looking for troublemakers amongst the crowd, and everywhere you look, there's a mass of hands as protesters make the V sign, the sign for peace.
I was very proud of my uniform, and I was told, "Oh, don't wear your uniform because you're liable to get something thrown at it. It's not popular to wear your uniform, and we advise against you wearing your uniform to travel." And I thought, why? What? And so you had to tuck it away and just forget that you ever went there, but it's very hard to, and you can't do it.
It was very difficult coming out of a war zone into reality. I found for about 12 months when I was in amongst friends that they'd be talking about things, and I found it difficult to join in that. I thought, well, why are they making mountains out of molehills? There's much worse things happening, you know, and it took me about 12 months really to settle down and to realise that I was actually doing this.
I hadn't talked about my nursing in Vietnam with anyone while I'd been home. I just had tried to put it all behind me. We talked more about our hard work, our long days, or the different things. You didn't highlight on people's injuries because everybody had their own pain in their own way that they were trying to manage, and you didn't want to inflict that on anybody else.
When Jack returned from Vietnam, he had to come home on the train from Sydney. Within 8 hours of coming out of the jungle, more or less, he was home in civilization with a new baby, and it must have been extremely difficult for him because he would always sleep with his knife under his pillow. To wake him up, I would poke him with the broom because I wasn't going to get too close to him.
My experience in Vietnam didn't so much affect my work, but it affected my family life. As me as a person, I was bordering on alcoholism. I was aggressive. And I was asked this question by a group of wives, Vietnam veterans' wives, how did it affect me, or how did this post-traumatic stress disorder affect me? And my only way to describe it to them was the same way that it affected your husbands. Oh, you mean you got aggressive and abusive and drank? And I said, yes.
Before I went to Vietnam, I was very politically naive. But of course, as soon as I got there, I realised how wrong this war was. And I understood the full horror for both sides. And so that when I did get home, and I was aware that the moratorium marches were on, and I fully supported that. But somehow the veterans were blamed for being part of that war in Vietnam. And many of us carried that resentment around for a lot of years until we had our Welcome Home parade in 1987. I believe that the healing started on that day for a lot of people, and those resentments were able to be dealt with and put behind us.
Today, the Australian nation pays tribute to the high courage and loyalty of those men and women in this much delayed welcome home from Vietnam. We also honour the 538 Australian and New Zealand soldiers who died. And now we can see the nurses, members of the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps. There were 2,398 servicemen wounded, and they were well looked after.
It was a very moving celebration, and we were welcomed home with great enthusiasm. And the streets were lined with old soldiers and the tears running down their face. And that was very important for us.
Frankie Hunt and I'd known one another for a while. And at the Welcome Home parade, he was in his wheelchair because his legs weren't working very well that day. And he said, "Give us a push up, sis." So I pushed him onto the stage and I just stood with him. And of course they played Only 19. And that was the first time I had ever cried about Vietnam. And I had to do it in front of all those people. And Frankie said to me, "It's all right, mate, I'm crying too." So it was very emotional. It was wonderful. Vietnam taught me that life was very fragile and very fleeting. You should live your life to the full.
My year of nursing in Vietnam has really given me time to think probably more deeply about politics, about what people do to each other, how cruel people can be, how we take life so lightly, because one minute it's there and the next minute it's not. I think I probably grew up very quickly in that year. I don't think I lost anything. I didn't lose any youth or... but it was a year that I found intensely satisfying. And I have absolutely no regrets about it.
Dad and I talked about our experiences in each of the wars, but mostly it was just all the fun stuff and the funny anecdotal evidence. All nursing is difficult. You try not to dwell on things that are unpleasant, and I choose not to watch war movies or anything on the television or read anything in books which can trigger those memories, because they will last forever.
Vietnam, in many ways, shaped a lot of things in my life. I'm grateful for every minute of every day, and even though I don't think about it all the time, when I do, I think about the blue skies and things that a lot of our boys weren't able to see again.
The photograph of me with a little boy is the most beautiful photograph that I have ever had taken. Every time I look at it, and I look at it every day, because my son, when he was in East Timor, he had a photograph taken holding a little East Timorese girl, and he got the two photographs and made a print and gave it to me. And I know how he felt about that little girl, but I often wonder what happened to the little child that I held. I look back with fond memories of that day and the contact we had with those people because they were so gentle.
Well, we've all got our own personality, and the best bits of it has to shine. And you sincerely hope that you were courageous and your sense of humour came to the fore when it was necessary. And I'd like to think I had all those, but I was very likely lacking in the odd one.
Eastern States viewers are invited to an online discussion with the Vietnam nurses filmmakers and several nurses featured in the documentary. To participate, go to www.sbs.com.au/Storyline Australia.